there are so many there. Yeah. Hello, colleagues. Hi. Please, could we pick our headset here? Let us pick our handset. Yeah, this mic is not audible. Hello, good afternoon. Is it afternoon or evening? Good evening. Good evening, colleagues. Can you hear me? You can't hear me. Oh, I need to wear mine. Oh, great. Yeah, sure. You are right. Yeah, sure. Hello? You can hear me clearly? Okay, thank you. I would like to take this opportunity to welcome you to this event. My name is Jessica Mwanzia. I am the Climate Finance Lead at Pan-Africa Climate Justice Alliance. And I would like to request our colleagues over there. Hello? We are starting. We are going to begin with the photo here. We are beginning our meeting with the photo here, so I'm requesting members to come to the front so that we can have our photo. Yeah, right now. Hmm? Yeah, the speakers, yeah. Okay, I've been corrected. This one is for the speakers. All our speakers, I kindly request you to come to the front. We have a photo, please. I would like to call out our speakers. We have Dr. Alfonso Somorin, the Regional Principal Officer at African Development Bank. We have Professor Seth Osafo, the Legal Advisor, African Group of Negotiators. We have Veronica Jakarasi, the Executive Director, Institute of Sustainability and Development Finance in Zimbabwe. We have Mbadha Angweta, Senior Advisor, Climate Finance and Development at German Watch. We have Ansen Nyambe, the Director of Sustainable Environment and Blue Economy at African Union. We have Memory Kachambwa, the Executive Director for FEMNET. And we have Charles Mwangi, he is the Head of Programs at Pan-Africa Climate Justice Alliance. I kindly request our speakers to take the front seats. Um, I take this opportunity to welcome you to this event, whereby we are going to be looking at the new climate finance goal. We are calling it NCQG. We are going to interrogate how the discussions, the negotiations have been taking place within the course of the year, and where are we at the moment, and if we have a probability, a chance of having this goal during this COP. We have had 11 meetings discussing about this goal. But at the moment, we are still having so many things that we have not been, the negotiators have not been able to agree on. So where are we at the moment? That's what we are going to hear from our panelists, and we are going to have an opportunity for questions and answers. So I request we be attentive, because we are just having 1 hour period here, so that we don't ask questions that have already been addressed. So I take this moment to invite Dr. Alfonso Somorin, the Regional Principal Officer at African Development Bank, to paint for us the climate finance scenario in Africa.
Thank you very much. A very good evening to all of you. Thank you again for staying. It's difficult to get people staying at this time. So my job is relatively simple. I've been asked to paint the picture of the current landscape of climate finance on the continent. Well, first globally, but also very much on the African continent. If you've got a pen and a paper, we're going to be writing numbers. So please, it's simple arithmetics. Let we do it together, and we'll be able to make sense of it. So I think about 12 years ago, we started tracking, and I use the word, we started tracking the global climate finance flows. 12 years ago, it was in 2012, and then it was about $360 billion. As the year proceeded, we got better in the methodology, we got better in the data, climate finance data, globally. And by 2019, 7 years later, the global climate finance flows was around $632 billion. So please keep those numbers in mind. 2012, $360 billion. 2019, it was $632 billion. But we also got better in the data, but also in what was counted to be climate finance or not. And by 2021, in fact 2021 through 2022, and these are all data provided by the Climate Policy Initiative. By 2022, the global climate finance flow was $1.27 trillion. And that's one part of the story. So 12 years ago, 2012, it was $360 billion. By 2022, 10 years later, we have moved into $1.27 trillion. But if you're going to talk about the global climate finance flows, you must talk about it in light of two things. First, the cost, this flow, the amount of money, but also what is the cost of action? What was the cost that was needed? So by the time we got to $632 billion in 2019, we had estimated that globally we needed anything between 1.6 to 3.8 trillion dollars in order to be able to reach that 1.5 degree goal. So the 600 billion was nowhere near what we needed. But then we made a significant push, moving to $1.27 trillion by 2022. But this is what has happened again. The cost of action, the cost that was needed then, had moved to at least $5 trillion. So you don't just look at climate finance just only in terms of the amount of resources available. You also have to think about the cost of action, and ultimately it gives you a sense of the cost of delayed action. Because as we delay action, the cost automatically grows higher. And that is what is happening. So keep that in mind. But let's bring this down into the African context. So globally, 1.27 trillion. In fact, we just received the result for 2023. And for 2023, it is now $1.5 trillion. But the painful thing is that out of that $1.5 trillion in 2023, only $43 billion came to Africa. Only $43 billion came to Africa. So if you're there, I want you to do a simple arithmetic of proportion. And that tells you as well that there's a huge disparity on the one hand between what is needed and what is supplied. So there's a huge disparity between the demand for climate finance and the supply of climate finance. That's one. Number two, in Africa, the region that needs the most resources, because from our NDC, we said we need about $250 to $270 billion every year. So out of the $270 billion we need in Africa to implement our NDC, only $43 billion has been received by 2023. So when we talk about this conversation around an NCQG, it's important to understand that we should not be talking about $100 billion anymore. And I want to make it clear here. The $100 billion from the days of Copenhagen era is supposed to be seen as an element of trust. It is not the quantum of resources needed today. There are countries today that the costs, or even regions on the continent, that in terms of what they need over the next 6 years is way over that $100 billion. So $100 billion in the conversation should not be anymore. Rather, it should represent trust. That can you commit to something and can you deliver it? The last point I want to raise in the interest of time is also to embrace the fact that we need to, as we make a case globally for more transfer of capital into Africa, we need to also understand some systemic complex issues within Africa when it comes to climate finance. It will interest you to know that 65% of that $43 billion went to 10 countries in Africa. So 10 countries responsible for 65% of all climate finance. In fact, the top 100 most vulnerable countries, the countries that are the poorest of the poorest, most climate vulnerable on the continent, receive barely 10% of the total climate finance flows. So there's also a bit of a mismatch in the distribution. So number one, the money is not enough, and we should not be talking about 100 billion as what is needed. We're now in the trillions. We are now in the trillions. And secondly, within our continent, we also need to look into making sure that there is fairness, there is justice, that the finance is going towards the regions and the countries that need the resources the most. The last point is we will also need to be able to find a way to raise more domestic resources, more resources internally, and to be able to partner with our developer counterparts in order to be able to scale the finance that we need on the continent. What do I mean by that? What we are spending on our adaptation and mitigation actions as a continent is still low. And that's, if we link it, if we consider it to be a development ambition for us, responding to climate change is part of our development goal, then we must find a way that we can spend our resources. Let me give you a bit of a context. Today, the pool of capital sitting in our domestic banks, in our insurance company pension fund in Africa is $2.4 trillion. I always imagine $2.4 trillion sitting in Africa's domestic resources. I always imagine if we can unlock just 1% of that for climate action. I'm not even going to 10%, just 1% of that. we will be talking about $24 billion of our own resources going to climate action. So money is not scarce, but money is not evenly distributed. And we are not talking about scarcity crisis, we're dealing with distribution crisis when it comes to climate finance on the continent. I'll keep it there for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alfonso. We are hearing that money is not the problem. There is a study that has been done by Oxfam, and it's saying that only 6 people in the world are holding 2/3 of wealth globally. So that means that money is not the problem. But how do we make sure that it is distributed to people equally? People are able to access it. We have heard about the way climate landscape has changed for the last 20 years. Now we are standing at 1.2 trillion. But are we experiencing that in Africa? Can you say this where the money is flowing? Are the frontline communities accessing this money? Are their conditions changing in any way? For me, I would say not too much has really changed. So we need this kind of conversation to make sure that this money can be unlocked to reach these frontline communities. I would like to transition quickly and invite Charles Mwangi, who is going to tell us about the Africa felt needs and what kind of just element we can take into account in negotiations, and what the African CSO can do to catalyze action in securing climate finance goal and its delivery mechanism. Charles Mwangi is the head of programs and research at PACCHA.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I'm going to be very brief because I will simply say that the needs of the communities at the front line of climate crisis is exactly what Dr. Alfonso Somorin has actually outlined here. But just to say that we have always insisted that adaptation remains the top priority for the continent. And indeed, countries are already spending more than 5 to 15% of their GDP to finance adaptation, because adaptation or climate change leaves us with no option but to adapt. And adaptation really doesn't become, a choice. It's something that we really have to do. And when you ask me about what is the actual needs, for the communities, especially at the front line of climate crisis, I would dare say the figures presented here is basically what is needed. But again, the adaptation gap report for last year is very clear that the gap we have for adaptation is about 387 billion, US dollars per year. And that is what is needed up to 2030. And I therefore dare say that the current, adaptation resources coming through, about 20 billion, does not necessarily make a lot of sense compared to that particular gap that actually exists. But again, I also want to say that this disparity between mitigation and adaptation in Africa is becoming a serious issue. We listened from Professor Nyong, the Director of Climate Change and Green Growth from AFDB, indicating that in actual sense, for Africa, the balance is about 10%, 90%. So about 10% is what is coming really to finance adaptation, which is way too little. But again, even what is coming for mitigation, how much of it, for example, goes into supporting renewable energy investments? If you look at renewable energy investments across the world, only less than 2% comes to the continent of Africa. So even what we are referring to as 90% mitigation, only a small portion really comes to this particular continent. But most importantly, we have to think about even the little that is coming, does it reach the frontline communities? And we have been talking about these principles of access, the issues of finances being adequate, the issue of availing these resources in a timely manner. But the most important concept in this regard is ensuring that we are actually localizing action and that that money actually reaches the communities at the front line. But the figures that we have from various studies indicate that of all the climate finance that comes to the continent, it's only about 10% that is actually utilized at the local level. And even that 10%, we are not very sure how much of it goes to projects that are actually locally designed. So accessing the money is one thing, as little as it is. But in terms of ensuring that that money reaches the grassroots and that it implements projects that are actually locally designed is another big, big question. And 10% is not really a very good figure. So where does the 90% go? Does it just go to the intermediaries? Does it go basically into issues of other engagements that are not necessarily focusing on local level, project implementation? I think that is one question we need to ask ourselves. And in this regard, therefore, we must ask ourselves how many levels do we have for localization? And I dare say we have about 5 levels of localization, of action. We have a level we call no localization, and in this regard, we have projects being implemented where communities benefit, but in actual sense, they are not involved in prioritization or in framing of those projects on the ground. And therefore, you must be careful where we are on the ground, not to think that we have a localization of action simply because communities are benefiting. And I think we need to go a notch higher and ensure that we have systematic engagement of the communities at the front line, but at the same time, we ensure these communities have got the urgency in terms of prioritization. They're taking urgency in terms of the issues of framing of some of these particular innovations and projects at the ground level. And therefore, I dare say that even as we continue pushing for the 1.3 quantum for NCQG, we must also ensure that we have structures in place and policies in place to ensure that there is localization of that money. Of course, we've been told that we need about $3 trillion US for implementation of the NDCs that we currently have within the continent. But again, next year we are going into revising those particular NDCs. How much then are we going to require for implementation of the same against the 1.3 quantum that we are calling for? Thank you. May I stop at this level?
Thank you very much, Charles, for those insights. We have now gotten a glimpse of how the climate finance architecture looks like in Africa in terms of how the finance has been flowing. And now, Charles has just summarized the felt needs in Africa. We need now to transition quickly and speak about the gender considerations that we need to take into account as we negotiate for the new climate finance goal. So I'm going to usher in Memory Kachambwa. She is the Executive Director for FEMNET. You can come over here, Ma.
Thank you very much. Let me start by really acknowledging what Charles was talking about, frontline communities, and say that the frontline communities that Charles was talking about consist more than 50%, if not 52% on the African continent are women. So it's important, even as we are talking about the quantified goal, to actually center the frontline communities and to center women. Globally, women and gender organizations receive less than 2% of development aid. And if you look at that 2% of the aid that actually goes to women and gender organizations and constituencies, when we are talking about climate change, we are talking about adaptation, damage and loss, we are talking about mitigation. It's very important for us to actually ensure that we have specific percentages and we have specific quotas that are actually allocated for the frontline communities, especially and particularly to women's organizations. So what are some of the things that we are hearing and some of the things that from gender considerations that we should really be looking at? I think we are in agreement that in the morning I spoke about how the issue of debt on the African continent has got a direct correlation to the financing of the continent. So I think we should be calling, as climate activists, as gender and feminist activists, for cancellation of that debt. Because if we are talking of new financing and new financial architecture which is not transformative and is not responsive to what the African continent and the crisis that we have, then the money that will come it will be the same story like we heard about the 100 billion. So I think we need to constantly push for new sources of money. We need accountability, we need transparency, we need the means of tools of actually being able to measure how much money is coming to the continent. I think so far, the 2 days, we haven't seen the money, and I think it's really upsetting that the talk is going back and forth. So in the actual negotiations, we need to fight that this COP does not become a failed COP where we do not have commitments which are genuine. We need to also continuously fight for the mandate of financing as critical to climate action. So I think some of the actions that we really need to ensure is that we need to ensure that the grant, there is direct access. I think Charles talked about access, but also when we talk about grant-based finance, we are looking at finance where women and gender constituencies are able to access, which does not require collateral, because we know that issues around land rights, but we should also look at granting systems that are also flexible and that are also available at all levels. We also need to look at non-market solutions, which are capitalist, which are extractivist. I think we're hearing a lot of, it's going to be an investment. Where does that really put women and gender and that constituency? So, because we find that most of the women that are in the informal sector, and our colleague from the Africa Development Bank was telling us about the quantum that is actually required. And I wondered in that quantum whether women are actually counted, because we know women do a lot of unpaid labor, which is invisible labor. When there is a climate crisis, the first responders and those that are resiliently staying, even if there's a drought, there's a flood, are the women. Yet they are not considered adequately or counted in terms of their contribution. So we should always ensure that it's critical to ensure when you are speaking about this goal, when you are speaking about these finances, that we also look at issues like unpaid care. We also look at issues of sexual reproductive health and rights. And we are also looking at ensuring that there is technology which is gender responsive and which is also gender transformative. I think the last that I may want to also add is also ensuring that when you talk about domestic resource mobilization, we need to look at what are the current mechanisms that and the leakages that are there. Africa loses close to 60 billion each year through illicit financial flows. And I think it's important for us, even as we are talking, to ensure that the Africa Group, which is pushing for a UN tax body, to ensure that within that, we are also ensuring that we have enough finances, we are able to capture enough finances for climate action on the continent. And I think just lastly to say that for the monitoring systems should ensure that the gender data is disaggregated and that is also accessible. So when we count and we are talking about tracking these finances, we are not a monolith across the continent. We must also be considering where those finances are going, and we must also disaggregate it, taking into consideration the circumstances. Where is the money going? Why are we not getting the money and the commitments? I think one thing, and what we experience on the Africa continent, is that most of the money is being channeled towards militarization, and we haven't had that coming out. We on the continent, with the minerals, the critical minerals, the crisis in the conflict countries are actually linked to the militarization agenda. So in this scope, if we are not going to talk about why the countries, the polluters, are not committing money and using that money and diverting it for militarization, which is killing us and putting us in a state of underdevelopment, these are the things that we also need to push as the Africa group and coming from the continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Memory. I would like to say that listening to that conversation on gender, I've just remembered what Canada was proposing yesterday during negotiations on the new climate finance goal. They were saying that the rights of indigenous people and workers' rights are supposed to find themselves in this new goal. I think it's a nice conversation because most of these people, workers, are women. In Africa, they are farming and doing so many other things. So their rights also are supposed to be considered in this new climate finance frameworks. Children issues and all that, only 1% of climate finance is flowing towards children issues globally. So where are we standing at the moment? Just something to think about. I would like to usher in Professor Seth Osafo. He is a professor of law, the legal advisor at the African group of negotiators. He is going to outline the general position of AGN on the new climate finance goal and tell us the strategies that have been deployed to rally support for the $1.3 trillion quantum being proposed by African group. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jessica. I must say that the new collective quantified goal has become the main topic for this conference. It's because the government of Azerbaijan made it clear that this was going to be its major objective as far as this conference is concerned. Climate finance, why has it become an issue? As we talk now, we have 3 different treaties under climate change. The first one was the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was adopted in 1992 and entered into force in 1995. The convention talks about finance, and it's because that during the negotiations, the developed countries accepted that they will provide financial resources to the developing countries to enable them meet their commitments under the convention. I think I'm maybe being very technical, but the convention basically has 2 main groups. There are other small groups, but you have the developed countries who are considered to be Annex 1 and the developing countries. We are not an annex, but we are developing countries. And essentially, the basis is that climate change has been caused by the development process of the developed countries. They have emitted more carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere more than the small developing countries. As a matter of fact, Africa emits between 4 and 6% of the total emission of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But then it is a continent that is affected the most. And the same applies to the small island states, the least developed countries, and other developing countries. And so during the negotiation of the conventions, the developed countries accepted that, look, historically, we are responsible for what we are facing now. The accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that is causing the earth to get warmer and warmer. And so, again, they accepted that they will provide financial resources to assist developing countries to adapt and also to mitigate and to also to address the adverse effects of climate change. As a result of that, the convention has what we call a financial mechanism. And that financial mechanism addresses finance. One fund was created under the convention, and that was the Global Environment Facility. But that was essentially to address or to assist developing countries to report their commitments and what they have done. So basically, it was not to fund adaptation or loss or damage or anything like that, but it was to enable them prepare reports that will be submitted to the Conference of the Parties for consideration. And then another fund was established under the Kyoto Protocol. And this was the Adaptation Fund. And it was also because it was realized that for Africa and other developing countries, adaptation is key. We emit very little. In fact, the total carbon dioxide emissions from developing countries was less than 25% of the global total, if you take out China as it is now. And so the Adaptation Fund was created to assist developing countries to address the question of adaptation. And then over time, more recently, under the Paris Agreement, another fund has also been established. And this is the Green Climate Fund, which has become very well known. But then, if you put all these funds together, they are not doing much. In fact, it's quite small compared to the needs of developing countries. And more recently, in Sharm el-Sheikh, parties adopted the decision to create the Loss and Damage Fund. And thankfully, last year in Dubai, the fund came into being, and it is being prepared to operationalize it at this conference. In fact, a lot is happening. But how much did parties pledge for the Loss and Damage Fund? $850 million. And that cannot do much. $850 million to address the concerns of all developing countries, the small island states, when it comes to loss and damage. So that is why at this particular conference, the new collective quantified goal is at the forefront of the negotiations. In Copenhagen, and my brother Somorin has said something about the 100 billion. In fact, that was the first time in the negotiations that such a figure was mentioned. But let me also say that that figure was not negotiated. It was not the basis of negotiation. And I always tell people, some may have heard me say it over and over again, but at the Copenhagen COP in 2009, that conference was running into difficulty. It was actually going to fail. And the developed countries were very concerned about it. Obama was there. A whole host of heads of states, just as we have here, were there. And in order to save the conference from failure, the heads of states came together from the developed countries and they put a figure together. We didn't negotiate it. And so the 100 billion, you could say, was picked from the air. And over time, that figure has become insignificant. As a matter of fact, even the 100 billion a year starting from 2020 has not been realized. And so now here we have a situation where we have to negotiate. And the negotiations are not easy, and they are not going to be easy. Yesterday, at the first meeting of the consideration of the agenda on new collective quantified goal, it was realized that what had been proposed by the co-chairs was not acceptable. So the report that the co-chairs had prepared for consideration at this conference was rejected, because in a way it was lopsided in favor of developed countries. And so the co-chairs have been asked to go and prepare another report for consideration starting from today. So it shows you how difficult and contentious this is going to be. But hopefully something good might come out of this conference. We are hoping that the quantum that developing countries in Africa are proposing, this 1.3 trillion, would be realized, or some part will be realized. So on this note, I think I will stop here, and then thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I would like to welcome Dr. Sam Hongala. He is the Senior Climate Change Advisor at African Union Commission. He is going to tell us how the African Union is mobilizing the other Pan-African institutions towards securing the NCQG. Welcome.
Thank you, Program Director, and all protocols duly observed. I wouldn't be quoting the figures that Prof has quoted and my brother Funsho has quoted. And it's good that they've all spoken before me, and also Charles and the rest. That makes the work and my life a lot more easier. And you talk about the African Union, what are we doing? All what they have said and Professor Seth have said are what the support that the African Union and the endorsement that the African Union has given. The marching order to the African group of negotiators is to negotiate the 1.3 trillion. And over time, when you talk about the African institutions with the support of the AUC, African Union Commission, we shouldn't forget that even the establishment of the African group of negotiators, the pronouncement on the Africa Ministerial Conference on Environment, its establishment, and the Committee of African Heads of States on Climate Change are the decision of the Assembly of the African Union. So with that decision, you know that they can move with strength. That is the political weight that the African Union provide. Other Pan-African institutions, such as the AUDA NEPAD, you know what they've been doing in terms of issues of adaptation, issues of establishing even some centers. We have the one that was recently approved at the last assembly in February to be hosted in Cairo, to also address issues of climate adaptation. These are products of the assembly decision. Then you wonder if negotiations or the position of the African group of negotiators will carry weight without the endorsement from the African Union through the CAHOSC. So we've provided all the support to some of the Pan-African institutions and given them the backing that they need to negotiate on climate finance over the years. Again, early this year sometime, we supported the AGN, and Prof was there, where they packaged all the negotiations and what they're going to be taking forward here in COP in Baku. The African Union Commission supported that convening, where even these issues of finance, the new collective quantified goals on finance, was packaged together. And then with the political weight, it was taken to the African Ministerial Conference on Environment. But the African Ministerial Conference on Environment don't give that political endorsement for it to become an African position. They will require the political endorsement of the Committee of African Heads of State on Climate Change, the CAHOSC. So in September, thanks to the work of our AGN, the AMCEN, precisely September 24th, the African Union Commission, which is the secretariat of the Committee of African Heads of State, then facilitated the convening of CAHOSC special session, because there is also this COP coming up, where these positions, African position, was endorsed, and that is what they are running with it. Professor Osafo knows that weight has to be carried, and it was, passed on to all the heads of state that this is the position of Africa that we must all support. So down also back at the commission, through the implementation of the African Union Climate Change and Resilient Development Strategy and Action Plan 2022 to 2032, as well as the Green Recovery Action Plan 2021 to 2027, we've put up measures to ensure that the last miles also benefit from issues of climate finance. And that has led to the establishment of the Climate Finance Unit within the Directorate of Sustainable Environment and Blue Economy that is in the Agriculture, Rural Development, Blue Economy Department of the African Union. This is to help our member states to access climate finance, not only accessing, but utilize climate finance. Through the Global Climate Change Alliance Plus, we are supporting our member states to undertake climate change adaptation projects across the continent. And this, again, is part of what we're doing in delivery of the mandate given to us, and as well as in the implementation of the strategy. Through the Green Recovery Action Plan, GRAP, we are supporting currently 7 of our member states and 3 regional economic communities to access climate finance, and also supporting and holding them to develop project pipelines, bankable project pipelines, to ensure that climate actions are taken at the country level and up to the community level. Initiatives such as the Africa Adaptation Initiatives, the Africa Renewable Energy Initiatives, and the whole of the Great Green Wall initiatives. All these initiatives are Pan-African initiatives endorsed by the African Union to support our member states in addressing issues of climate finance and as well as adaptation and mitigation. So at this point, let me submit that as the Commission, we stand ready and working and supporting all our institutions, both politically and even on the ground, at the member state, at the regional economic communities, and especially our negotiators, to ensure that the new collective quantified goals is negotiated in the interest of Africa and meet the African realities on the ground. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to quickly transition to Veronica Jakarasi. She is the Executive Director for Institute of Sustainability and Development Finance, Zimbabwe, and she is also a mitigation negotiator. She is going to tell us what is happening in the negotiation rooms in regard to the new collective goal. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Director of Ceremonies. Good evening to you all. As already said, my name is Veronica. Let me start by not reiterating what has already been said by Professor Osafo in terms of the ambitious 1.3 trillion per annum as the expected outcome of the new collective quantified goal for the African group. And I'm happy to announce that this number has also been adopted by the Group of 77 in China to strengthen the developing countries' position. And what is important for us is to understand where this funding will be flowing to in terms of mitigation, ambition, adaptation, as well as loss and damage, and the access of this funding. Is it going to be grants? Is it going to be loans? Is it going to be concessional loans? So these are the issues that we really are going to be guarding as we are advancing the NCQG discussions, because what is important is to ensure that we don't indebt African countries and other developing countries in relation to climate finance, because we are cognizant that already 34% of developing countries that are highly indebted are in Africa, and 8% of 8 countries are highly distressed in terms of debt. So that is a real challenge, and we need to make sure that significant financing of this 1.3 trillion flows to developing countries as grant financing. So that is one other component that we need to guard against and make sure that it is even clarified in terms of the financial flows. And then secondly, the aspect of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. They are trying to, our developed partners are trying to have a shift, as already agreed in the Paris Agreement, in terms of the countries that are in a position to do so, where they are targeting some of the developing countries to also contribute to this quantified goal. But what is important is to also take on board that the responsibility of providing climate finance lies with developed countries, and they should take leadership in providing this particular financing. There is also the issue of provision versus mobilization. How much is going to be provided in public financing, in grant financing, vis-a-vis how much is going to be mobilized? If 1.3 is mobilization goal, without any significant public financing, then that remains a challenge for developing countries and a challenge for African countries, especially where we are really advancing the issue of African special circumstances and the issue of vulnerability and the need for adaptation and resilience building for the continent. So what is important is to ensure that the NCQG clearly outlines the goal from an accounting perspective, including adaptation, grant financing, non-concessional loans, and export grants should not be considered as climate finance. So when you talk of any commercial loan financing or any export related credits, those are not going to be considered as climate financing. So as we are going to be accounting for 1.3, there is need for clarity in terms of what are we accounting for, what are we calling climate finance. And the reason why this is important especially where we are coming at a time where we still don't have a commonly agreed definition of what is climate finance. So that really burdens countries, because others report their traditional ODA as climate financing, which is a challenge. So there is need for clarity, and for us it's really around the already existing enhanced transparency framework is a good start to help developed countries start accounting for climate finance, and we should not renegotiate the transparency framework. Then there's also the aspect of the disenablers. How are we going to deal with the disenablers of finance, often exacerbated by within developed countries, including through an asymmetric international finance architecture that is addressed in terms of the quality of concessional climate financing and the decision making that is done in developing countries. So there is need to also ensure that the global climate finance architecture is really favorable to support the way climate finance is moving across and within countries, and also to ensure that any areas that are remaining within the 100 billion are also paid by the developed countries. So what is also important is around the issues of the scope, the issues of access, and we are not ready to negotiate the recipients of climate financing, because what they are trying to do, they're trying to split the developing countries, have small islands, least developed emerging economies and all those, and then start defining who is more vulnerable, who is less vulnerable. What architecture are we going to use? So we are not ready to discuss the issues of the recipients of climate financing. Every developing country is eligible to access climate financing. So these are the issues that we are really keen to move forward, even as we discuss the aspect of the NCQG. And we're going to be looking at different trade-offs and the resources also that should be flowing in terms of this NCQG, in terms of, are they adequate, are they affordable, are they predictable, are they grant-based, are they concessional, and are they not in anyhow enhancing debt, but actually facilitating for fiscal space to use in other sectors for development. So the aspect of also understanding that development will be based on sustainable development and poverty eradication for developing countries and the Africa special circumstances remains pertinent. And I know Professor Ofaso has already talked to the issues of the national determination and the needs determination in terms of the African needs and the needs of developing countries. So we are looking forward to an ambitious NCQG, and we hope it will come to the favor of Africa and the developing countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Veronica. We have another speaker. We are going to transition to Mbadha Angweta. She is the Senior Advisor, Climate Finance and Development at German Watch. We have heard so many things about Africa and what we are thinking, what we are doing. Now we want to hear something about North. We are saying, oh, we want North to provide. Let us hear the mind of that region. So, Mbadha, you are going to tell us, you are going to respond to this question. How does the North perceive the urgency of securing NCQG, and what are the opportunities and for collaboration with Africa in securing this goal? Welcome.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me, and thanks for the invitation to answer the question you just posed. So first, I think there's two questions. So I will start by responding to the question of the perception of the urgency of agreeing on NCQG. I think from the statements we've heard, it's clear that the countries of the global north also appreciate the urgency of agreeing on the NCQG, and in several fora, both at the negotiation level and also at the higher level, they've made it clear that they want to reach an agreement at this COP in terms of the NCQG. I think for some countries it is particularly pressing because there is a danger that not agreeing on NCQG would send a really bad signal in terms of the functioning of the multilateral process and of this convention, particularly at a time where we see that some major economies, or one particular major economy, the US, is probably going to leave the Paris Agreement. And That combined with the possibility of not reaching an agreement on something so important at this COP will send very, very bad signals for the future of the Paris Agreement and the Convention. So I do think there is an understanding of urgency in agreeing. However, I want to start by answering the second question by saying there's still a lot of disagreement between developed countries and developing countries, including African countries, about what the nature of that goal should be, and many, many aspects of it. But I'm not going to necessarily focus on what the disagreements are, because the question is more about the opportunities for collaboration. So maybe I'll focus more on where there are opportunities to collaborate. And by collaborate, I mean there's still different views about these aspects, but in some particular aspects of it, there is the opportunity to try to find some sort of consensus that could be beneficial for Africa and other developing countries. But I will start by addressing the elephant in the room, which is the quantity of finance, right? And I think many of the speakers before mentioned the 1.3 trillion that Africa and now other developing countries are requesting in terms of provision and mobilization of climate finance. And I think that will be one of the major disagreements and difficulties in this agreement, because developed countries are speaking about trillions. They are not speaking about the same trillions, and I think that's important to understand, because what Africa and developing countries are asking for is trillions of provision of public finance and mobilize finance through that provision, through public finance. And when developed countries speak about trillions, they speak about private investments, they speak about national budgets, they also speak a little bit about provision and mobilization, but that's not the main part of the trillions. And this is going to be the key disagreement in this COP that will need to be resolved. However, there are some opportunities for collaboration, and I just wanted to highlight a few things. And I don't mean to imply that there is agreement in these things, but that there is in the details of how these things should be addressed, but that there is agreement that these things are important, and therefore there are opportunities to collaborate around this. So one of them is access. I think across the board we've heard a recognition in developed countries that access needs to be addressed, and it has been mentioned a lot from both sides. So collaborating on improving access to climate finance is one of the areas where collaboration is possible, even though, as I said, that doesn't mean how to improve access is necessarily agreed by everyone, but I think there is an understanding that this is important, right? And so that's an area where more collaboration could be found and more discussions could be had of what could be important for Africa in terms of improving access that could be reflected in the NCQG, especially direct access through certain mechanisms like the Green Climate Fund and all the other funds. But also there's a lot of emphasis on harmonizing the different modalities of access across different funds, because there's many funds, there's the MDBs and so on, and all of them request different things. So facilitating harmonization so that countries don't have to chase around different requirements is one of the ways. There's also issues that are really important for developing countries, like the cost of capital, like how expensive it is for developing countries to access funding through loans, like the cost of accessing loans and investments. This cost is significantly higher in developing countries, and I think there is a recognition that this is important to address if we want African and developing countries in general to be able to access and invest in their own mitigation, especially, maybe not so applicable to adaptation. So addressing cost of capital and addressing debt sustainability issues generally tends to generate consensus. It's just the mechanisms that are not quite agreed. So developed countries have their own mechanisms for debt treatments and so on. That's not exactly what African countries are asking for. They're asking for more deep restructuring of debt and cancellation in some cases. So there's still a lot that can be worked on in there, but there is at least a recognition that this needs to be addressed because it is important and will impede investments in the future. I think someone mentioned, and one of the speakers before mentioned the distribution of the finance, and how can finance be moved from the global towards the global south, including the private sector if relevant, but mostly also, you know, all sources. And I think that's also an agreement there, that we need to improve the ways in which finance flows towards the south and doesn't stay in the north. You know, and I think, for example, what can we done so that there's more investment coming in terms of private sector? That's one thing, but also how it can flow, for example, in terms of addressing tax issues. That's also an area where some collaboration is possible. And I think the final point that I wanted to make, because I think one of our speakers also mentioned it, is that there is across the board a lot of agreement about the need for gender responsive climate finance. I think that is one of the least contentious issues, at least from what we have seen. And also other things like youth, children, and so on, that usually tends to generate a lot of consensus. The problem we see right now is that in the current text, this is just at the level of principles. And as the speaker mentioned, we need more operational language, for example, in terms of how transparency arrangements will address gender responsiveness, so gender disaggregated data and all of this kind of stuff. More work needs to be done in that sense. But I think across the board, gender responsiveness, youth, children, and other disadvantaged communities, and how to address their needs and have more responsiveness to their needs is something that generates a lot of agreement. It's just a matter of working on how to make it operational in the NCQG. At least with agreement between what's been expressed in the Europeans and some global north. Not sure about across the board, but definitely to the global north, these are important things as well. And just now, a lot of people were mentioning that, for example, this year, the Standing Committee on Finance, which is a body of this convention, held a forum in Tanzania about gender responsive climate finance. And a lot of people are saying those recommendations that came out of that forum could be included in the work of the NCQG and so on, because they represent an important source of information for that. So just to conclude, I want to say, I mean, there are areas for collaboration. There are a lot of disagreements as well. But at least, as I said before, I think everyone has made it clear that it's in everyone's interest to reach an agreement at this COP. So I think enhancing that collaboration could be important to allow some sort of good outcome for everyone to come through. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mbada. At least we have had there is a chance of having this goal set here in Baku. So we need to continue being hopeful, and we believe that even those other areas of disagreement, we have a long period to go. People are going to agree, and we can actually have a goal that can speak to the needs of Africa. Considering that North are speaking about trillions. You see, I was so excited to hear about trillions. And Africa, we are also speaking about trillion. That is a very good progress that we are making. So I'm not going to open this meeting for questions. We are going to forgive me for that, because our time is already gone. And we just had 1 hour in this meeting. Unless there is anything, something burning that needs to be communicated, I would like to close the meeting. And thank you so much for coming. Thank you.